Bud is an actor, storyteller, stand-up comic, and solo performer. He's performed all over the Bay Area, as well as in LA, Israel, and Boston. His show, What They Said About Love, won Best of the 2016 San Francisco Fringe Festival. Please welcome to the stage, Steve Bud! Bring him in! Yes!
Thank you, Wonder Dave. In case you're wondering, Mike Capizzolo is my stunt double. Hello, friends. How are I got to get this mic just right, so tough. I think that's about right. When I was 31, I moved back in with my parents for a bit. I know, right? Thank you for your support. Friends, right? I guess I was looking for, a refuge, a break from the workaday world, a chance to become friends with my parents. I was broke, is what it was. But I did hope to connect with my parents in a new way. And, well, let me start by introducing my dad to you guys. He sits in an armchair in the corner, his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper with classical music turned up loud. You come in, you ask him how he's doing, newspaper lowers a bit, and he says, "Oh, pretty good. How about you?" "Oh, good. At dinner, he sat with his head lowered over his plate and shoveling food into his mouth, saying little, really, except, "Please pass the salt." So imagine my mother's and my surprise when my dad came home from his desk job at the EPA in Boston that winter in great spirits, and he couldn't wait to tell us about it. He said that he'd gone out to lunch that day and had treated himself to a beer, something he'd never done on a work day. And on his way back to work, he'd given $1 to a bum, also a first. And when he got back to his desk, his spirits soared. He said it was like a veil had lifted. Raved about dinner that night like a guy who'd never eaten before. You know, the flavorful chicken dish, the broccoli cooked just right. And then after dinner, he turned on his favorite classical music station, stood by the stereo with a smile on his face, and moved his hand in time to the music. My mother said, "Do you think he's okay?" I said, "Yeah, I think it's great to see him like this." "It is," she said. Oh, she might not have thought so, but I did. I thought it was great, but it was only one night. It wasn't a lot to go on. The next night, Tuesday night, my dad came home from work in even better spirits. He said he had this great idea, and because he worked at the EPA, he was at the right place to make it happen. He thought that the 5-cent deposit on bottles and cans was too low and should be raised to at least 25 cents. He said, "This will solve two problems at once. It'll get more people to recycle, which will be good for the environment, and it'll mean more money for the homeless who collect bottles and cans. I can't believe nobody's thought of this before. I just have to figure out who to talk to about it. This is bound to improve my position at work. They'll have to start paying me more." "Don't count your chickens before they hatch," my mother said. "Chickens? We'll be eating Cornish hens." My dad stayed up long after my mother and I had gone to bed, and I could hear him like pacing around, rustling through papers, talking to himself with occasional "aha." I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't know what to make of it, but it seemed kind of like a miracle to me, like this incredible, wonderful transformation. It was like my dream dad had appeared out of nowhere, this guy who was like energized and full of ideas and couldn't wait to tell you about them. Anyway, the next day, my dad came home from work with what were for my mother extravagant purchases, a box of Italian chocolates and a woolen Scottish cap. My mother looked at the receipt and said, "We can't afford things like this. He's going to bankrupt us." My dad rolled his eyes at her. She stormed from the room, and he shouted after her, "Living with me might not be easy from here on out, but it won't be boring either." Then he turned to me, and he said, "What are you doing tomorrow night? How about dinner and a show? Ibsen's Ghosts is playing downtown, and I'd love to see it." "Sure," I said. I was thrilled to be asked. It was the first time my dad had ever asked me out. And I'd been living in the area since graduating from college. I couldn't wait. So the next night, Thursday night, we met up at this Turkish restaurant on Beacon Hill. And my dad told me more about his ideas about raising the deposit on bottles and cans. And then he told me some more ideas, and then more, and more, and more. It wasn't exactly the conversation I'd been looking forward to. And then we went to see Ghosts, which is a play about a diseased dad who passes his illness on to his son. So you have, the sins of the father, dysfunctional family, and all that stuff. I doubt he thought about any of that when he invited me. Well, my dad responded to the play with vocal enthusiasm. Magnificent, exquisite, yes! I was embarrassed, and people around us were clearly annoyed. And then when the play was over, my dad jumped to his feet, beat his hands together, and shouted, "Bravo!" I mean, the production was good, but it wasn't that good. And I started to think, maybe something's wrong here. Maybe there's something a little off about this, not the miraculous transformation I wanted to think it was. But I didn't really want to think about that. The next day, Friday, my mother in the late afternoon got a call from a family friend who worked alongside my dad at the EPA. And she said his behavior had him concerned that he couldn't seem to sit still. He'd taken to greeting coworkers quite loudly. And she wanted to know if we'd noticed anything. She said there'd been a staff meeting that morning at which some sort of routine policy change had been announced. And my dad had responded with a loud standing ovation. She thought we should take him in for a psych evaluation. My mother wanted to know what I thought. And, I didn't want to think anything was wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't say for sure. So, yeah, I thought it was probably a good idea. Now we just had to run it by my dad. So that night at dinner, my mother shoots me a worried glance and then turns to my dad. She says, "Honey, we're really happy to see all these changes, and we're glad you're feeling so good, but we're concerned, too, by the sudden shift, and we think you should be seen by a psychiatrist." My dad slapped the table and said, "Great, I'm all for it. I want to get to the bottom of this, too. Let's not waste another minute." So we threw on our winter coats and headed into the city to a psych hospital. While my parents were in meeting with a psychiatrist, I sat in this small, dimly lit waiting room, flipping through back issues of People and Time. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I needed to know the verdict. I mean, my dad was okay. He had to be, right? I mean, he was the happiest I'd ever seen him. Yeah, he needed to learn how to rein it in a bit, but he'd figure it out. Well, after about 45 minutes, my mother emerged. "They're keeping him," she said. "The doctor said it's a classic case of bipolar disorder. He'll be here at least a month until he's stabilized, maybe more." And then the doctor came out with my dad so I could say goodbye to him before they locked him up. My dad clapped me on the back and said, "Oh, don't be so glum. I'll be out of here in a flash. Just you wait and see." On the way home, my mother told me that the doctor had been surprised by the diagnosis because, as some of you may know, bipolar disorder usually shows up, in your 20s, 30s at the latest. But 60s, highly unusual. So the doctors loaded up my dad with Haldol and lithium and who knows what else. And after about 2 weeks, he was calm and quiet, quieter than I'd ever seen him. Too quiet, really, for my taste. And then after about 2 months, just before he was released, kind of on a whim, I guess, the doctors decided to give my dad a CAT scan. And they discovered that he had an inflammation in his brain. So that meant he wasn't bipolar at all, that somehow the inflammation had put him into a manic state. They never did find out what caused the inflammation, but they were able to treat it fairly easily. So my dad came home on this wet and windy April afternoon. He went straight to his armchair in the corner and picked up the newspaper, asked him how he was doing, and he said, "Okay." That night at dinner, my dad sat with his head lowered over his plate. He had nothing to say about the food or, well, anything else for that matter. My mother said, "Back to normal. I don't think I could have lived with him if he'd stayed that way." "What's that?" my father said. "Nothing. I was just saying that I'm glad you're better. You gave us quite a scare." My dad stared off at nothing in particular and then down at his plate. Nobody said anything for a minute or two. And then my dad said, "Please pass the salt." My dad lived for another 25 years, but never spoke of the incident, if I can call it that. And as for my dream dad, that electric, magnetic, upbeat, energetic idea factory, he was never seen or heard from